Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, it's really a great pleasure and honor to be here. And I thank you for sacrificing such a beautiful Saturday day and coming here to talk and to listen about Russia and trying to understand Russia, which I think is the most important and most difficult thing. Well, thank you for such complimentary introduction. I suddenly felt like a monument to myself. Well, I'm afraid to disappoint you because my talk today will be kind of half amateurish observations more than scholarly paper. I'd like to share with you my thoughts and I would say field studies, my observation of the Russian society for the last 30, 40 years. The problem is that whenever you talk in the international community, to the international public, whatever topic it is, it was always end with the conclusion that Russia is some strange Orientalist exotic country, which you can never grasp by mind. You can only believe it, as Fyodor Tuchev wrote. So in a way, the best explanation of this, I would say, thesis, has been done by Sir Winston Churchill, who said that Russia is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Unfortunately, in Russia, we share to a certain extent the same vision of our country. As we know, of course, this idea of this strange land where is everything upside down, which is a topsy-turvy world with no logic, only passions, horrors, and many other things. So it started and was formulated in the 18th century by the French enlighteners. In a way, I would say we use it in Russia in a complementary way. So we're very specific, we're unique, we have our own way, so-called Sonderweg. You can't understand it. So Russia becomes an enigma to its own residents, so to say. I think probably it's high time to understand Russia, in my mind. In a way, if we look at the country as a country with its dramatic history, but still this is a country within the period of modernity. And we could see what different scenarios each of the countries produced going along this dramatic way, because the modernity is a very specific time, as we know. So then you can understand something, what's going on in such types of country as Russia. And we know that quite a lot of countries during the modernity, especially the early modernities, reacted to the challenges of these new times, not by opening to the world, but trying to self-isolate itself. So this is Portugal, Spain, Russia, many other countries, even Japan. So what's going on in such type of the country when there is no public space, no freedom of speech and media? It's always an illusion that nothing happens there, that the society is apathetic, and and then out of a blue, the revolution comes. Of course, you remember all these talks about the Arab Spring. Everything was just very quiet and docile, and then suddenly people go into the streets in a way. How could it happen? Again, if you look, it's quite a lot of very interesting books written about Russia, inside Russia and outside Russia in the Soviet time. No one could ever think about what happened in August 1991, how this huge empire of evil empire just collapsed in 3 days. Being in the barricades in these miraculous days and just watching people there and greeting this new Russia which was emerging with Yeltsin has won. So I thought that probably our intellectual and academic instruments are not adequate to the situation. So we need to find some new instruments to understand the stealthy evolution of societies in the closed countries, if we use Karl Popper's word. So what are the ways when the society changed to a certain extent, when somehow it just crushes this rigid political system? I just wanted to give some examples and my ideas, which coincide with many academic studies. What was peculiarity of the late Soviet society after World II society, after Stalin's death? What happened there, and how the society tried to express this disillusion with these Marxist dogmas, how they find, that people find these new ideas and the system of values. Of course, everyone knows about the history of Russian activists, right activists, which started their activity in the early 60s. But at the beginning, it was a handful of people. The outstanding right activist Lyudmila Alexeyeva, who has recently died, she was over 80 years old. She's a great woman. And I was happy to know her in her last years. She said that when we started, we were less than 10 people all over the country. So it was very much on the periphery at that moment. But the majority of people never thought about real political things. But they fought this very repressive system in another way, through the everyday practices. Social behavior. And the major thing was that it was fighting for the private space. So the idea was never touch your family and we'll be loyal to all your political things in a way, expanding this private space, creating these social platforms at the so-called Moscow and St. Petersburg Russian kitchens. That was kind of saloons in the habit of the 18th century French saloons and cafes, where people exchanged ideas, books, talked about different new ideas which they heard, and transmitted some illegal literature in many ways. No one knows how many kitchens existed in this way. I mean this point. How many books had been illegally imported into Russia and has been reprinted and disseminated through the country. Unfortunately, these figures are impossible to prove. And it creates a real problem for a historian because we need to have facts and figures. But I think the most useful tool for us could be that's the famous idea by Carl Ginzburg about this evidential paradigm, how you can study history based on some traces, some small threads where you can decipher and understand the whole. So in a way, I think this is the best way really to study Russian society, just trying to find these small symptoms of change. And then you'll realize that was real symptoms of the great evolution of the society. So all these horizontal ties which appeared in the 60s and matured in the 70s, the emerging of so-called underground culture, it was not only that people was doing something secretly, but they created a parallel cultural institutions which were very powerful. And in a way, that was a kind of, if you look at it now from the point of view how they functioned, it was the pre-internet era, but the system of distribution was absolutely the same. We could say they recreated the future horizontal internet websites and social webs, creating the way of transmitting information. And in the end, it helped quite a lot in fighting the Soviet regime. But I would say that's a rather interesting few moments as well. In a way that the Soviet propaganda was always based on the so-called atheism. But as we know, in reality, it was a pseudo-religious doctrine, very intolerant. And interesting enough, if we speak about the modern times, the classical example is that secularization of culture, that people stopped believing in God or creating some spaces where religion is not present. And strangely enough, fighting with this Marxist dogma, many intellectuals just became religious. Either it was Orthodox religions or Muslim or many other things, which is fantastic from the point of view if we look at these classical examples. But it was very important trying to create a new identity. So the modernized and the self-modernized society used, I would say, very traditionalist way to do it. I would say the same was with a situation with idealization and idealization of the pre-revolutionary Russia. So the imperial Russia was presented in culture, even in films, in many other ways, as a kind of not a paradise, but a very dynamic and wonderful country, and trying to find this new system of values, which was speaking of tolerance, of justice, social justice. Somehow these noble codes of honors were presented as a kind of ideal model. Of course, it's very strange because it meant the archaization of society. So it's a semi-feudal idea of nobility, in the manner of Southern States nobility, which was presented in Margaret Mitchell novel, something refined, wonderful, laws of honor, very respectful to women, all kinds of things. And some folk, narod, somewhere, the folk which don't understand anything, which we need to be educated, and many other things in a way. So I would say this idea was very productive during the Soviet time, because we didn't have I would say democratic bourgeois traditions, because the pre-revolutionary Russia was semi-feudal and there was a lack of bourgeois literature, so there is no basis for the liberal ideas within the country. The situation at least was compensated by quite a lot of translations from different languages. And it's very interesting, in spite of all the censorship, the majority of foreign classics and even contemporary literature were presented. And that somehow, helped to read something new, some new ideas coming from the outside. And probably the last but not the least, this is a strange situation with feminism. The Bolsheviks always proclaimed that they introduced real freedom for women. Really, she could walk, she could work. She had the same rights as men, so she could study and many other things. To some extent, it's true. But in reality, and there are quite a lot of research in the book, women found themselves in the situation of a double burden, because the traditional attitude towards her, basic obligations was the same. So she had to care for her children. She had to work because the man couldn't earn enough. It was a situation. So in a way, this idea of feminism has been discredited by reality. So strangely enough, in the late Soviet society, women imagined themselves being like, Turgenev girls, in light dresses, they're just romantic figures in a way. And so this strange cult of ideal womanhood, who is not working, and she has a very good partner who's caring for her in a way. That was absolutely utopia, but it was really important and explains what happened in the 90s. And this is the huge negative reaction to the word feminism in the 90s and even in 2000s. That's explicable because it was also, always connected with this idea of a woman who just lost her femininity in a way. So there's quite a lot of other interesting peculiarities of the late Soviet society. But I would say what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union, how all this specificity, all the specific traits somehow, were transformed in the post-Soviet era. Well, of course, quite a lot of women started finding rich husbands, as if it was the 19th century, with a very pathetic and tragic ends. I would say that till the last 10, only 5 years ago, the new generation of women started speaking about feminism as a very important issue. I'll tell about this a little bit later. But what happened, I would say, when Putin came to power, and why he managed to manipulate the society, which at a certain moment said that we wanted to live in a democracy. Of course, during the Soviet time, because people could not go abroad, and there was quite a lot of shortages of everything, it was a real idealization of the West as a kind of norm, where people are free, where is prosperity, where quite a lot of opportunities, where is the free press, in a way. And during the revolution of 1991, the major slogan or motto was, "We want to be normal." In a way, it really worked. But when the 90s came, with all these tumults, with a very difficult situation really for many people, it was very difficult in Moscow, I can observe it. But you can imagine, say, company town, where the only factory stopped and people couldn't have any work. That was almost tragic. Of course, when Putin came to power, the major thing he promised, it's a kind of stability. It sounds ridiculous to many contemporary people, but we should take into consideration that stability for the Russian society of the 20th century, that was luxury in a way, because you can't find a generation who could live peacefully, at least half of their life, without all kinds of revolutions, Cold Wars, civil wars, starvations, and many other things. So people started being nostalgic about the Soviet Union. It's mainly about 60s, 70s, and 80s. That was a short span of time where people could least plan their future. There were shortages, but there was no famine, which was enough for the first time. And suddenly, when at least they thought that they're going to live peacefully, then again the revolution came, people lost money, positions, and so stability at that way was a real virtue for quite a lot of people. So in this way, Putin could manipulate, but not too long. I would say for 10 years. This idea of stability, of course, was very positive promise, which somehow he did not fulfill. Another thing, yes, and it was a fragmented society because in the authoritarian, totalitarian states, no associations and consolidations are possible, and the states try to prevent all kinds of initiatives which are not sanctioned by the state. So the major problem of the 90s was just to build new institutions, what happened in many ways. But as far as so-called civil society, or civic society, as you say, that was a real problem, because in the Soviet Union, there are quite a lot of different groups of intellectual people, professional groups in a way, but there was no this common place, common platform for where you can consolidate, when you can fight for your rights. And, we thought that's very easy, but then you realize this is a tradition which should be, realized, fight for it, and teach it, because it comes from the family, from the school, and I would say for many years that was the major problem for the opposition, which could not get consolidated, not because people were not too bright or didn't understand what to do, but somehow they didn't know how to create compromises. And it appeared, yes, that's a real problem. One more thing, that's because of the Soviet state, at least after Stalin days, just make evolution towards so-called social states. Well, to some extent, in a way. So people strongly relied on the state. So they always demanded of the state that it should do this, this, and that. So in this way, I think that the problem for Putin now, because somehow he didn't fulfill the wishes of the people, because they relied on him that he will come and save them and give anything to them. And more than that, you know, in the 90s and even now, we can see this is tradition of intolerance, of this cold civil war. So where people are divided according to their political views, it's still very palpable and very visible in Russia, because the whole Soviet period was based on this class intolerance. And I think the major problem for us in Russia nowadays, just to overcome this tradition, and how we can find this I would say social peace, or you know, just on this, where this platform of uniting and how to do it. That's the problem, because whenever you hear or watch public talks, whether it's on television or even somewhere, even in the academic community in Russia, this border between the dispute and insult is very flexible. So immediately people start arguing with this way of civil war rhetorics. And this is again, there's a very huge and very deep trauma, which I think is understated, and people only think that, well, they're not educated enough or not too polite. It has nothing to do with education. It's part of the tradition. But, you know, I'm let's say social optimist, so to say. And of course, quite a lot of people would say that there are so many negative things in contemporary Russia, and I will agree. But really, probably because I'm a publisher, and the publisher is a spontaneous optimist, if you don't believe that the book you publish will change the world, you will never choose this profession. On the other hand, my involvement in charity, where I can see the society from another angle, and besides my short political activity, you know, I concluded that we underestimate the Russian society. It has quite a lot of potentials, which we don't see, because, you know, the focus, you know, is probably wrong. We need this kind of microscope and not telescope to see these strange, very stealthy but very important changes. And my observation in the everyday life, it's quite interesting, because when I explained it to one of my colleagues who made a report about the contemporary Russian society, somehow my views coincided with figures. So I noticed approximately 10 years ago, something happened in the society. People became much more friendly and polite to each other. I would say in the public transportation, in the subways, you know, somehow, and it's visible, because I remember that if you took a bus or a subway in the Soviet time, in the rush hour, and people were packed, of course, in there, you can't imagine the aggression that people, you know, just poured on each other with awful curses, you know, mentioning mothers, somebody's mothers, grandmothers, and many other things in a way. Nowadays, if you do the same, and people are just smiling, and sometimes they push them, they say, okay, it's fine, anyway. You say it's trifle, but it's not. I would say, as far as feminism is concerned, first of all, the new generation of women coming on stage, and they really started openly discussing all these issues, reading quite a lot of Western literature, trying to analyze the situation. Several years ago, there was a very important, I would say, event in the internet. This is #MeToo, where women, for the first time in the Russian history of the 20th century, started speaking about sexual harassment and violations and rapes and many others. It produced absolutely fantastic effects in a way, and I think probably this is a revolution of the mind. It's true, because it is quite a new phenomenon. More than that, there are quite a lot, of course, domestic violence, and this is a problem. And especially the state just implemented the law of decriminalization of domestic violence, which is awful, because the cases, of domestic violence just tripled immediately. But on the other hand, what I can see if you look at people, say in the malls, some entertainment centers, I remember in my youth, a man just walking with a baby carriage. It was such a rarity. And if he did it in such expression, if he was a Christ going to the Golgotha. It's true, because it was considered this is not man's obligation to care, for child, it's women. Nowadays, you can see just ordinary people. It's not intellectuals, I would say. Ordinary people just going. So a woman just want to buy some dress, and father just taking a baby in his hand, just feeding him or her, just playing with this. And somehow it's not, and his expression is just normal. It's normality, I would say, and not a sacrifice. Again, you would say that's nothing, but I think that's the most important. This spontaneous humanization of society is going on, and it's very visible. And on the contrary, the state's propaganda, it's military mobilization of society. But strangely enough, you could see in everyday life, people object to it. So a new ecological movement suddenly started around really 10 or 7 years ago. Before that, when my colleagues from the West asked me about that, I said, no, that's not a topic for us. Nobody just talks about ecology. But nowadays, this is one of the major protests movements which is going on in Russia, which I think it's really a very important sign. And more, just recently we had two very important protest marches. The first one in August, last August 2018. It was called the Mothers' March. And it happened that because nowadays our FSB, that is the former KGB, started creating provocations. So they're organizing the fake terrorist organizations, allure children and young adults into these organizations, and then started criminal cases against them. So when it happened, that spontaneously 7 women just said, let's go to this Mother's March, and we will protest because we need to protect our children. Otherwise, that will be a disaster. So unfortunately, I could not participate in the August march because I was not in Moscow, but it was warm, but it was huge rain. And so more than 1,000 women, and some of them men, just went through the center of Moscow. And I must tell you that nowadays we have such an unconstitutional act that you can't just simply gather and go. You need to so-called register to get that state should sanction, so to say, your work. But they were not allowed to do it, but still women came and went through the streets in the center of Moscow. Fortunately, they were not arrested, and I think that's an interesting thing. Speaking about these traditional values, there is something in this very notion of mothers going to the streets that even our repressive government and state somehow hesitated to arrest them, because it's something so basic. Mothers, just going for their children in a way. And before coming there, the last Sunday, it was the second march. It was called Anger Mothers March, or Mothers Anger March, so to say. And the occasion was that a right activist, a wonderful woman, Nadezhda Shepakova, was arrested, again on the false premises. And she was not allowed to visit her daughter, who was dying in the hospital, and the daughter died. And it was such a fury in the people. So immediately, we decided that we'll go to this march. So I just wanted to show you some of this. That's, again, something around perhaps 1,000, 1,500, no one counted the. So the women came, and their major symbol was the black heart. I think it's, no, next one. Next one. And that, it's me, by the way, with a black heart, and you can see with a toy, because this is the symbol which appeared in the first demonstration when women came with this children's toy and put it on the building of how you say it? Say it in English. On the Ministry of Justice, yes. It's an Orwell thing in a way, so they put all these toys on the Ministry of Justice, the building of the Ministry of Justice. So we went through the streets, and fortunately almost no one was arrested. And I think that's again quite an important thing. We have a theoretical feminism, but I think this kind of acts, this is the birth of, I would say, Russian version of feminism in many ways. It may sound strange, but I think it touches the very deep, strings of the Russian consciousness. But what is, I would say, more important, as I said, that in the Soviet Union, the right activists, but there's really a bundle of people, and they seem to be on the periphery of the social life. Strangely enough, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, this movement became a mass movement, really. And I remember that the last birthday with Lyudmila Alexeyeva, there are quite a lot of people sitting at the table and, of course, complaining to each other about awful situation in Russia. That's the typical table talks in Russia. And she was listening, she was half lying, she was 90 and quite ill, and suddenly she interrupted us and said, "My God, what are you talking about? We live in the Renaissance period. Can you imagine? There were 10 of us who started, and now look at how many NGOs are through the whole countries, and so many people are involved in this right activism." She said, "Everything is beautiful," she said, "and fine. Of course, there are quite a lot of dangers of this. People are arrested, but still, we could never imagine that we could win in this way." And really, it's an interesting case. And one more thing which I'd like to point out about charity. Charity institutions started at the late 90s. Before that, people who just became rich, and sometimes not so rich, helped quite a lot. This is, again, absolutely the blank page. No one studies it. But I think that many schools, hospitals, people, and many others survived just because of these personal charity acts. People who started in school and became entrepreneurs, they immediately give money to the schools to survive, so on and so forth. So these 10 first years, which was very difficult, but somehow really was very important for this, I would say, hand-to-hand charity. But real institutions, charity funds, started in the late 90s. And nowadays, there's quite a lot of them, and they're doing a great job, which is still not analyzed and systematized. But which is more important nowadays, this is crowdfunding, which became very popular. These public funds, which are just emerging everywhere, this again, I think this is new step, a step in this changing, in the positive change in the society. Probably you've heard about this absolutely fantastic story of this online journal, The New Times. That's the Russian, so it's, the name is English, but it's Russian. That's political journal, just writing about Putin in a very negative way, describing political life. And suddenly the journal was fined for 23 million rubles on the fake accusation that they did something wrong in the legislation thing in a way. And the idea was that they should be closed because there's such money and impossible in a way. But suddenly our oppositional newspaper, Novaya Gazeta, New Gazette, just asked people to contribute just trying to save the new times. So in 4 days, they managed to gather 27 million rubles, which was absolutely fantastic, and people didn't expect how it happened. It shows that somehow that people trying to protest, and now they're starting understanding what is freedom of press. that's the way they just show their attitude. And as Evgenia Albats, who is chief editor of the New Times, she was absolutely just flabbergasted, saying, I don't understand what's going on. How could it be? And then she showed me some of the comments when people were donating money, some of them 100 rubles, some of them 500, it depends. And people just wrote, usually I don't read your online posts. Well, I do not agree with many of your views, but this is the same of principle, And I think that's quite an interesting fact. And one more thing, which I think it's important. I wanted to stress out something. But yes, I could go on for years because there are quite a lot of so interesting phenomena, these threads, and which you can understand that people somehow, that society again is changing without huge protests. But in a way, all this amateurish evidence which I saw, somehow I thought that's my ideas because I want to see only the positive things. It helps you to work. But recently I could read, and I think it's for free in the internet, a report which was made by Mikhail Dmitriev, who is a sociologist, and psychologist Anastasia Nikolskaya. They made the report with the so-called field studies. They had the sociological surveys, so with this dynamic of change of the Russian society. And strangely enough, it's coincided with my personal views. There are just some figures. Nowadays, people are disillusioned about the state. They do not rely on the state. And now people started relying on their own forces. It's 94% who rely on themselves instead of the state, which I think is quite a revolutionary thing. One more, as I talked with you about the stability, which was very precious for people, but something has changed. Probably that's new generation that came of stage. But up to 90% of people want and are ready for changes, even if they are at risks. Now they stopped being afraid of risks and uncertainty, which I think it's quite a remarkable thing. But there is no aggression in the society. People don't want to protest, I would say, against. They want to protest for something. And this is the main case, because they can't find this new leader, the new slogans, which could show them the new way, something positive. And again, the major problem is not with the society, but with its leaders. So if we can say that there's a huge need of new political language, which people understand, new type of leader. And interesting enough, Putin was always a kind of epitome of the strong leader, which was very attractive for many years. But the recent polls showed that only 5% of people want to see a strong leader. The other wants to have that, speaking about social justice, and I would say legal justice most of all. So this aggression, to divide everything between everybody is not very popular in spite of our contemplations. Interesting enough, I think these figures, so I didn't expect such type of figures in a way. So the society is humanized, and this is coming from within, not from above. People trying to get consolidated on the basis, just trying to open new school, for instance. They accumulate money and efforts in a way. So saying it simply, it's grassroots democracy which is appearing in Russia. And I think that's the most positive case. Of course, everything can happen. We see that the state is trying to crush new institutions, persecuting NGOs, and many other things. But still, and one more thing, that's a very visible thing. That's about 10, 15 years ago, this volunteer movement appeared in Russia when young people worked in hospices, helping elderly and in the hospitals and many other things in a way. And it is not just 1, 3 occur. That was a real social and is social movement. Interesting enough, people themselves who are involved in this, they consider that's a kind of escapism, saying that's because we could not participate in a true political life. We found our refuge in such type of movement. I disagree, because I think it's much more important. This is a real political movement in the Russian circumstances, and humanizing the country, humanizing the consciousness. I think this is the major issue in Russia, and everything else is the result, and this is the beginning. Well, we shall see how it goes on. No one can predict what will be in Russia or in any other country, of course. So there are quite a lot of jokes that in Russia, not only future, but even the past is unpredictable. It's really true. But strangely enough, I do believe that this, I would say, fundamental change in the society, which looks for justice, peace, humane leader, it's quite, let's say, exciting, and well, I'm more or less optimistic about Russian future. I wanted to end my long talk, and sorry for my English, with a small video, so-called video opera. In Russia you can see that life somehow is more powerful, this life of society, which finds their own way in this very strict political system. As water, as river finds no way to go to sea. So I think that's a wonderful artistic representation. This is video opera by Dmitry Prigov, one of the central figure in the underground world, and I think that's the major artist. We've published a collection of his work recently in the publishing house. And he has a wonderful video opera which is called Russia. I'll show you. It's in Russian, but there's only one phrase. Dmitry Alexandrovich Prigov, who is main hero, he plays himself. He asks a cat to pronounce the word Russia. So he says, "Oh, Pussy, my dear, just say Russia. It's so simple." Let's have a look at it. The second person is a well-known artist, German Vinogradov. So, yeah. And his cat Vaska. I think you can stop it. Yeah, okay. Well, yeah. Any questions?
Mics up here, but you might be able to just say your questions loudly from the back of the room. I think it'll be okay.
Yeah, okay. The lady was the first there then.
Yes, thank you so much. This is a very insightful and interesting talk. I have a question about what you said about 94% of current Russian society is no longer depending on the state. So I wanted to know what you meant by depending on the state. And in the context of American culture, where there's this movement of anti-government, it's not quite the same as the state, or in French politics, where there is a reliance and a glorification of the state, I wanted to understand where the Russians fit. If you can answer that.
Yeah, I see. You know, relying, it's not only not believing the state, it's part of it, really. People stop believing the TV channels and the propaganda. Well, they still watch, but the number of people who believe all this news are just lessening. Relying means, because in the Soviet time, there was a consensus between the state and the people. So the state gives everything, the flats, medicine, education for free, but people are loyal. And in the post-Soviet time, quite a lot of people still demanded from the state, so they need this and that. And even in the best time, in 2000s, when the oil prices were high, people noticed that the state somehow trying to avoid all social obligations. And this is a strange situation because it tries to recreate this total control on the society, but not giving anything, which I think is a paradox, and I would say not the best way to deal with the society. But nowadays people are disillusioned, so they try to find the means, of their own survival, becoming more and more active, which I think is a good thing. And I would say the next step, they will fighting for their rights. Because in their attempts to get consolidated, they can see quite a lot of hindrances in the system of law, in the very strict and repressive institutions, just preventing them from doing that. But I think in a way, that's really a huge change. Yes, please.
Thank you. Could you speak for a moment about speak for a moment about gay and lesbian Russians? Do you see any positive developments for those citizens?
Well, I wouldn't say this is a very touchy topic, I would say, because I would say in the 90s and 2000s there was no problem at all, because it was decriminalized, so people could behave and live freely, and somehow that there was no topic at all. People didn't discuss it, or if they did, it was quite neutral. But after 2012, with this huge protest against the fake elections, that the state decided in quite old-fashioned way to create these inner enemies. And as we know, in such cases, this is either opposition, intellectuals, gay and people, well, the whole traditional set of dictators' tools to do it. Nowadays, yes, especially in Chechnya and many other regions, there are quite a lot of problems and persecution of the gay people. Well, of course, it's an awful thing, and probably the right activists are fighting and reacting to it. Unfortunately, at the present moment, the majority of Russian society is either indifferent or a little bit xenophobic. As we know, that's always a problem. But we shall see. We shall see how it goes on. Yes, please.
Would you describe the geographical space in which this kind of activity occurs? Is this primarily Moscow, Petersburg, large cities? What about small cities? This kind of activism, this kind of optimistic development. What about rural areas? Do we know that?
That's a good question. It's not only, of course, in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Of course, it's definitely in all big cities. There are quite a lot of examples. And by the way, ecological protests started not in Moscow, but for instance in Krasnoyarsk in Siberia, where they have awful ecological conditions, and there are quite a lot of huge demonstrations, but it has never been seen, reported in official media, because unfortunately, even the opposition media, because unfortunately this is centralized view of the country where only the things which happen in Moscow and St. Petersburg is important, prevents us to see the whole picture. But what I could witness and what I could hear, that all big cities are somehow very active. What about small towns and rural places? It happens there from time to time, but I don't have this information, probably people who are dealing with this. In rural areas, people are surviving. It's a very difficult thing. In many ways, they have so many basic problems that I would say ecological movements, for instance, it's not the major issue for them. But you can't say that the country is so big and so I would say, informationally fragmented. No one knows exactly what goes on in many places. I don't know whether it's for better or for worse. Probably it's for better. Too much attention to many cities or small towns will be probably not a good thing. But we have a wonderful online platform which is called Такие дела, those things. When they're describing quite a lot of activity goes on in different parts of the country. That is the platform dealing with volunteer movements, with charity, but with all kinds of problems, what's going on, protests, and how people create some kinds of interesting project to survive and to become sustainable and many other things. But still, I would say it's really tabula rasa, what's going on in the country. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My question is about leadership and leadership change. You described these very interesting and hopefully very positive, changes in society at large, and also that people's visions of leaders and what they expect of leaders, is changing. When is this going to become a majoritarian situation? Is this going to be a gradual change from the ground level up, or is there going to be some type of cataclysmic change at some point unforeseen?
If I knew, I don't know. It could be both scenarios. It depends on so many constellations of events, of the global situation, of the local one. I don't know, really. I can see the tendencies, but if you ask a historian of the pre-revolutionary Russia, for instance, you could find quite a lot of positive trends. But then the World War II started, World War I started, and all these trends, collapsed and became revolution. So it depends on many things. And interesting enough, so we can see quite a dynamic society, but we don't see the leaders. And I'm afraid it's not only because the state is so much afraid and trying to recruit. Of course, it's quite an important moment. But I would say that probably this is a problem to find this new political language. Not to continue all this out-of-date rhetorics, speaking blah, blah, blah about democracy, about the things that people don't understand. There's quite a lot of lofty words, but somehow what about people understanding it? So it depends. I think they will appear. It's not necessarily political leaders, but it could be, leaders of public opinion and many other things. We shall see. But what we can watch throughout the world, this is political crisis. Nowadays, you can't say what is left, what is right, and many other things. So in this way, Russia is part of this global crisis, political crisis, with its own peculiarity, of course. So I'm just intrigued how it will go on, what type of new leaders would appear. I think that if society develops so quickly, they must appear. Who will be, how it will be, what will be social metaphors that will present it to people, would be going through cultural lenses, because culture is a very important part of Russian life. And probably there you can find much more consensus in spite of all this, I would say, traditionalist policy of the state towards culture. Or not, or somewhere else. Could it be new religious language speaking about policy? I don't know. We shall see. But that's an intrigue. Please, yeah. This one, yeah.
Thank you very much for a really very interesting talk. And I like your thesis. I'm thinking about the Brezhnev period, for example, when it was an era described as stagnation, but there were, of course, so many underlying things going on at the same time. Society was radically changing even during the Brezhnev era. A person like Tatiana Zaslavskaya, who was a sociologist at that time, was describing the rising problems and the dissonance, if you like, between popular opinion and the state. So I would sympathize very much with your argument. But on the other hand, you know, we can see contrary trends as well. You've mentioned them yourself, such as intolerance, xenophobia, and so on. How do you put those two things together? On the one hand, you're seeing these sort of optimistic trends towards perhaps greater tolerance and changing values, but on the other hand, we're seeing the opposite happening. Rise of right-wing groups, of people, of Nazis and others in Russia. How do those two things fit together? What can explain that?
Well, I think it's naturally in all countries you can see these confronting movements in a way, and who will win, that depends on many circumstances. You know, I wanted to point out some positive things, because usually speaking of Russia, we stress you know, the negative one, but undermining these positive things and tendencies in society, probably we're losing our game. So my idea to pay more attention to these positive trends, trying to articulate them, you know, to analyze them and to understand that we have some kind of the possibility of some exit. Otherwise, you know, that Russia is always presented as a kind of vicious circle, that nothing can be changed, nothing can be done. But if you have this catastrophic scenario, you will continue to reproduce it. So they can see that many things that people are doing in their practical life are not legitimized. Symbolically and rhetorically. And, you know, I talk quite a lot with people, I'm just very interested in what they're doing and thinking. So sometimes they start talking awful things. Well, they watch these major TV channels so they can talk some awful things, you know, these Americans trying to conquer us, this Ukraine is awful, blah, 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 all the things. So if you don't pay attention, say yes, 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 of course, and you start asking them about their everyday life, what they think about their children's future, what they're doing, by the way, and then you could see absolutely different picture. So this is the gap between this discourse, I would say, and living practices. This is the problem, because in a way it turns out that they're quite in their everyday life, they're quiet people, you know, clinging to democracy, I would say. But in their rhetorics, because it's propaganda and there is no alternative leader, no political life in a way, just they repeat all these things. But the funny story is, for instance, if it's small town, the only thing they have for the public entertainment is cinema. Every Saturday, people put their best clothes, go to the cinema theater, and watch some American thriller, taking popcorn, watching and then. But if you ask them about America, they will start cursing and saying, "Oh, this is." So this is a very strange situation, but we must deal with this. Yeah? Yes. Okay.
Very much. Very synthetic presentation. I don't know if you can hear me. I'm afraid the microphone will go there. I have a sort of comment that becomes a question, and it has to do with the number of self-reliant Russians that you mentioned. The bit that really struck me was throughout the 90s, people would tell you that they can't rely on the state, they can't trust the state. That was a very prominent discourse. But it was in the kind of in the framework of an invective. They felt like the state should be doing certain things, and it's not. And it sounds like at this point they've convinced themselves that they can really rely on themselves and don't want anything from the state. Whether that's good or bad is, you know, questionable, because of course if you don't expect anything from the state, you can have a kind of a libertarian version of, you know, snow removal where everyone takes their own car out and then has no roads to ride on, or you can have more of a kind of grassroots mobilization that you're writing about, and it really depends on how broad that circle of we is. that people think should be fighting for their rights, right? Not just their own personal rights, but of some kind of imagined community. And this is where it becomes a question, because I wonder if there is sort of a connection between the two themes that you outlined as kind of parallel. One is the tendency of people to be kind of kinder and nicer to each other in public spaces, and the creation of these new groups of sort of pariah citizens or non-citizens, LGBT populations, migrants for sure. So to what extent is this kind of new respect is limited to a group of largely middle-class, white, recognizable people, precisely because they're kind of, it's not apportioned to other groups, and in that sense, that circle of that we is not as broad as we would hope. So I very much want to be optimistic. I should say that I actually want to be.
Thank you. Yes, of course, there are quite a lot of problems, especially with migrants. This is a problem, I would say, not so much of people, but of propaganda. I would say that's xenophobia, which is present in all major medias. This anti-immigrant discussions trying to present some awful laws. Of course, people are very receptive to this way. It's very easy, as we know. Racism, xenophobia, in a way, this is the easiest way for inadequate government to deal with people, to separate them. And this is a huge problem indeed. Yes, of course, I don't say that when people feel kinder, that's, 100% and they're so much educated, enlightened in this way. I say about the tendency. As far as migrants are concerned, this is a long work and efforts changing this side. And we know the American history, we know the history of many other countries. It's always a painful way. And the eternal process. Because in the times of crisis, all these demons are appearing again. So there is a problem, besides that Russia is such a multinational culture and country, which somehow, strange enough, has never been articulated, I mean, not only in presenting, but in the governmental policy. And this is so-called Russification, which is going on, and so creates very many problems. And we see quite a lot of nationalistic revivals in many ethnic groups, just because of this, I would say, stupid policy. Well, there are quite a lot of problems, it's true. But I try to discern some positive trends which could be developed, or we could try to help to develop. And I think it's very important. Yes, please.
I just have a quick question about U.S. sanctions. In terms of not popular response in words, but U.S. sanctions in terms of their effect on the grassroots level and people's real lives, daily lives. Is that have any effect at all, or is it just in terms of rhetoric? Does it have any effect on people's daily, precisely that realm you're interested in?
Well, it depends. I wouldn't say that sanctions were very effective. First of all, we know in such countries with authoritarian leaders, all kinds of outward sanctions only helps the leaders to stay in power, because he's become the uniting figure. Of course, this sanction created very unpleasant things for many NGOs, because nowadays they're afraid to take foreign money. We have this awful legislation about the foreign agents, and if you're taking money, and almost all organizations could be labeled like that, and they'll have quite a lot of problems, in a way. As far as for the ordinary people, the problems with medicine, because it's not sanctions, but anti-sanctions, which were invented by our parliament, if we call it parliament, so to say, I would say, they created this awful situation because the sanctions were against certain companies and people. But anti-sanctions somehow affected quite a lot of people as well. Because first, it was huge debates around the medicines and medical things which do not exist in Russia. And at first, in the anti-sanction laws, they were forbidden to bring to Russia. So it was huge protest. Then somehow they changed a little bit. So in a way, not sanctions, but anti-sanctions, which are produced itself, yeah, it affects people quite a lot. Wow, yeah. How much time do I have? No, I can talk forever. I mean, the schedule. Okay. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I'm interested in particular in your evaluation that protest movements now in the Russian Federation are not necessarily against something, but they are for something. This is a very interesting development, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about it, because there are, of course, many social historians who argue that it's very difficult to have an assertive protest movement. That it's always going to have this kind of dialectical, polemical edge. So, for example, in the American feminist Judith Butler's last few books, you really get a sense of traditional gender roles are very destructive, they're corrosive, they're artificial constructs, and yet there's something, they're makers of grotesque wonders. And so in order to tear down these wonders, you need a strong response. So saying you're for something by itself is not enough. You need to be against. You need to, in some sense, fashion a tool for dismantling, demolition of ideas that have, this long lineage that are completely destructive or malign. So there's that, sort of starting from scratch in some sense, by destroying things before. Within the Soviet and Russian context, there's some of that as well, but in the Soviet dissident context, you have a couple of other different moments. So, for example, the Soviet dissident Andrei Amalrik, shortly after he was arrested, he wrote in his diary, I am against the Soviet system and the militarization of culture that it represents, but I don't want to just be against it. I want to be for something. I want to have something that's assertive. And he said, on the basis of my experience, my research as an historian, I have found in pre-Petrine Russian history that occasionally there has been a strong sense of the law. The Russian phrase was "чуткое ощущение закона." So in other words, there's a sense of the need to find a recoverable past that can be sort of brought into the present. So my question, I'm tipping over into the question now, which is, where does this positive protest come from? Is it from a sense of discovering old legacies, as Amalrik was trying to do to some extent? Or is there a sense of the need to sort of cut themselves off from the past and create an entirely new present? As Dean Martins once sang in one of his songs, we have to accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative, no messing with Mr. In-Between. So where does this positive movement come from? What is your sense of the reality of it on the ground level? Thank you.
Yes, of course, that's, if you say about this negative protest, it's quite visible even in these fake elections. There were regional elections where people voted for some technical figures, just not to vote for those who were just presented by the Kremlin. And there were quite a lot of scandals of this thing. What I'm trying to explain about positive things, that's people do not go on public protests just because they're against something. It should be something so special, for instance, famine coming, those people go on the street. They are not so belligerent, I would say, in spite of all this military propaganda. What is lack in the society and what people want to? This is some prospect of future, which was closed by Putin. Because in the 90s, in spite of all the hardships, somehow people were promised that we're building a new democratic society, which was, will be the supremacy of law and justice and better standards of living in a way. And besides, in the 90s, quite a lot of new fields opened as far as mobility, social mobility was very high. And that was quite a lot of positive things in spite of all this havoc, economic. But then with this so-called new stability and this idealization of the Soviet Union, so all the project of future was closed. And I think people feel that we need all kinds of some hopes, even as individuals. You can't live without this, some ideas of what I will do in the future and how it will see my own future. And, speaking about the past is also a very painful thing. The history, the Russian history of the 20th century was so awful and so dramatic. I understand people who don't want to listen to anymore because it creates some kind of humiliation. And unfortunately, still, this is a problem because when speaking about you and the country, people always mix the country and the regime. So speaking about patriotism, this is a booby trap. If you tell people, that Stalin was an awful dictator, bloody dictator, this was this and that, and they say, okay, so our life and our parents were senseless. It couldn't be. So we try to, to idealize even the awful past, just in order to, to present some, to give some sense to your own being and to the life of your parents and grandparents. So this is a great problem, how to present the past without any lying, but give people some perspective of better society. I think this is a great intellectual task. But people really want to think about future, for better future. I think it's a challenge to the intellectual society, to the intellectuals, to present this new vision of future. We have quite a lot of work to do together, I would say. Yes, please. Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. Mm-hmm.
Hi, thank you so much for coming today. I understand that domestic violence is part of every culture, but in your opinion, how did the 1917 and 1991 revolution shift in gender roles affect this epidemic in Russia?
Sorry, I didn't hear you well. Could you repeat it? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sorry. I understand that domestic violence is part of every culture, but in your opinion, how did the 1917 and 1991 revolution and their shift in gender roles affected this epidemic in Russia?
I would say that the problem of domestic violence is a very important one. The major problem to speak about Russia, that you can't find any true figures from the Soviet past. Because almost all statistics and sociological survey were always under ideological pressure. So we don't know, for instance, whether domestic violence in the Soviet Union was less or more than in the post-Soviet Union. Nowadays, I remember that when I started working in the Soviet Union and I started working at the television, every year we had to present some figures of success and development in our own sphere. So we all invented all these figures, just showing the dynamics. And that was absolutely a usual thing everywhere, at every type of enterprise. And can you imagine the situation when all these figures were gathered there in Gosplan, and they created this, you know, the visions of development of the Soviet Union based on these false figures. So, not surprisingly, that in 1991 it's all collapsed. I don't know. I think that it's always existed, but it's never been even announced as a problem in the Soviet Union. Nowadays, I don't know whether it's the same or it's more or not, but at least it became the topic of the public debate, which I think is quite an important issue. You know, it's stopped being normal, you know, part of norms. And this decriminalization of domestic violence is somehow, this is hello from the past. In a way, this is a strange situation because if you listen to our officials, you know, members of parliaments, people who are in charge of this ideology, in a way it's a very naive rhetoric because in the Soviet Union, at least people pretended to say something nice. Now they talk as they think. And that's created a strange idea in a way that's absolutely absurd. At least I'm happy that people started speaking about it and articulating as a kind of crime, in a way. This is a progress. Probably it's not a big one, but still I think it's quite important.
Thank you. I'll try to be very brief. Thanks for a fascinating talk that has left me with many intellectual questions. First, about comparative histories. I come from Spain. When you speak about Russia, we have so much in common. From
Yes,
histories of the
exactly.
being orientalized, being considered different, connections, sympathies, definitely Russia to Spain, Don Quixote, accepting our kids in the Civil War. These common histories, where are they? Where is this Europe helping us understand each other, where we have so much in common? Thanks for mentioning. Also, your concept of feminization, so important. Women are, feminist movements in Europe are becoming huge, not just to fight for women's rights, but to intervene in politics and change politics. And in that sense, if I can humbly make you a suggestion, I will tell you stop using humanization and use feminization, which I think is one of the things that is happening from what I've heard you. And the other thing is, I admire very much in your talk your emphasis in intra-history. Beyond official history is what is happening on the street. Your use of the term politeness, the increasing politeness, to me was fascinating. What does it mean? What change does it indicate? How does politeness, how is it connected to politics, to policy? And I thought that intra-historical attempt to understand a society was important, brilliant. Thank you for it. Leaves me thinking. So my question, Chechnya. We have an exhibit of a former Smith student, photographer in Chechnya. My question is, could you give us a tiny intra-historical analysis about some attitudes you have seen in people about Chechnya, not big formal things? Your neighborhood people, you know, how do people feel about Chechnya in your neighborhood? I don't know. Some kind of intra-historical context.
Well, Chechnya is such a special case. You know, I'm not sure that I can tell you some things. Well, I could say that that's the major, the tragedy of the post-Soviet situation, and one of the fatal mistakes, I would say, of Yeltsin government to start the Chechen war. And as we know from history, so these mistakes will plague us forever, as it was in the Caucasus War, which will never end and is not ending. I don't know what to do with it. What we can say about public opinion, unfortunately, because of all this war and mutual hatred and terrorist attacks which really happened, the attitude towards the Chechens, that's common Chechen, is very bad and very prejudiced. And quite a lot of problems for Chechen people living in Russian cities. I can see it in Moscow. They're very much traumatized because people don't want to give the work. They're prejudiced them and insult them quite a lot. And this is deep, deep problem, and I'm afraid no one knows what to do. And I sympathize with the successor of Mr. Putin, who will be, I don't know, but what to do with this problem. You know, you need to solve it somehow, but no one has. And by the way, when I mentioned the affinity between our countries, it's true. You know, we had a special issue of my journal, New Literary Review, dealing with so-called the anthropology of closed societies. And we compared Russia with Franco-Spain, with Portugal, with Japan, with Cuba, and many other countries. And especially, I think, really, that's why Russian people love Spain so much. They prefer to stay there. Yes, there are quite a lot of things in history. This is belligerent church, you know, many things, civil war, authoritarian things, you know, quite a lot of things where the countries, which could never be too close, present the same patterns of behavior and many other things in a way. And I think that's very important to understand Russia, not create again a new riddle about that. I think that was one of the most important projects for us, because we found so many similarities between the cultures, even with Japan, how this the late modernization produced so many interesting traumatic effects, for instance. This is a long talk, but I think, yes, we should stop dealing with only this national entities, and we could see the modernity, you know, in many different, from different points of view. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I was curious, you mentioned a little bit of nostalgia showing up for the stability in the later Soviet era. And I'm curious about how that fits into progressive activism and how that shows up.
Well, I don't know. You know, when I was speaking about nostalgia, that was a real huge wave of nostalgia, which especially middle-aged and old people in Russia in 2000 started, you know, towards the Soviet Union. Funnily enough, in the 90s, no one was nostalgic. People were trying to survive, and there was no time of all this nostalgia in a way. You know, somehow rights activism can do parallel, you know, just develop parallelly. And sometimes, you know, that's an interesting. So a person could idealize the Soviet Union, but could be a right activist at the same time. Or can vote for Putin, but being one of the most active volunteers. So in this way, I would say that political dimension probably is overestimated. In this shrinking political scene, you know, there is almost no political life. It's useless to talk about, you know, political views in a way. People, yes, some of them say they're anti-Putin, we believe in Navalny. Some people say, well, I'm not interested in politics at all. So others say, okay, I vote for Mr. Putin because I can't see anyone else who could at least guarantee us something. What is something no one knows, but still in a way. But I stopped looking from this point of view on people's behavior. And I think that the major task for us to stop this civil war mentality, when you judge a person first and foremost only for his political views. I think it should be a private task, but more important, what they're doing and what they're doing for society, how you behave to your neighbors, to your family, to your colleagues, whether you're professional or amateurish in many other ways. And I think it's especially important for Russia, which still lives in this, you know, that separated way. And, you know, after the annexation of the Crimea, we had so many personal dramas. The people nearly divorced because, say, the husband was for the annexation and the wife, for instance, against it. And I think that's the problem of the older regime, which always produced this class distinctions as the most important thing. That's political issue, which is defines a person. So some of them are still, idolizing it, and but political activists are acting. They are saving people. I think that's very important. That many people say, I'm not thinking about politics, abstract things. My aim is to help and save people. And this is part of humanization. This is the first phase, of course. And I'm sure that then these political issues will appear, but on a different stage.
We're only going to be able to take 2 more questions. We have one here and one at this table back here. And then we'll be breaking for lunch, but there will be plenty of time to engage and talk with each other and with Irina at lunch also. So, and afterwards, yes, all afternoon. It's amazing how many questions there are here, but we do have to limit our time. So one here and then.
Thank you so much for this talk. It really gave a name to something that I've experienced over the past 10 to 15 years going back and forth to Russia, the humanization. It's really been something that I brought back every time and noticed. My question is actually about activists' decision to engage in the political structures at the very grassroots level. So all of the activists, for example, in Moscow who ran for Moscow City Council and even sort of lower legislative branches. Do you think that there's any promise in attempting to engage in a grassroots way in the political structures that exist? Or is it more worthwhile for activists to spend their time in these other forms of activism that are more person-oriented and not politically oriented?
Well, I think both is important, and I'm very happy that quite a lot of young men now go into politics and trying to participate in this either local, fighting for the power on the local level in a way. I think it's also very important. It gives them some kind of experience. The major problem of the 90s, when so many new people came into the political and social life, that they were totally unexperienced. And we all live either in some laboratories or sitting in the libraries and many other things. But there are some things which does not depend on the regime. This is the way how you deal with social life, with bureaucracy, and many other things. So probably, in many ways, because of that, we didn't manage, to preserve many achievements of the post-Soviet, and we were too inexperienced. They said we didn't know how to consolidate on what issues in a way. Now, I think this is the period where people trying to do it again. But now they're much more experienced in many ways, understanding better the society and how it works. I remember on a personal level when I started my journal, I was an academic person. I worked for some time in the Soviet journal, but I was an editor. So I have quite a lot of lofty ideas, wonderful topics to do. But when I started, and there was a special period when I could start almost anything without money. That was a special talk that I could talk, for hours describing how it's a hilarious time it was. But when I started, suddenly I realized I don't know anything about practical things. Because you need to manage it, you need to distribute, you need to count, you need to fundraising, you need so many other things in a way. That was a huge cultural shock. But in a way, it gives you some new view on the society, and you stop being this social autism. You try to overcome the social autism, thinking about that if I'm full of great ideas, it's enough for that. So in this way, these 20 years were spent not for nothing, but I would say young people who start now working very early, they understand much more about the society and people that we did. So in this way, yes, we need some time, patience, and in a way humility to study your own society, to try to go into the politics. It's true, and also to help people. But this is complementary, I would say, and somehow it's connected with each other.
This question may take forever to answer, but I will ask it anyway. One of the things you said which really intrigued me was that no publisher would want to publish if he or she didn't think that the books he or she were publishing would change the world.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you two questions which are related. First of all, is there one, or are there two books that you could mention which you think could have changed the world, should change the world, and why? And more than that, I actually am interested in Irina Prokhorova as a woman who is a publisher who goes to work every day, and what she encounters. You talk about bringing life down to the daily. What is it like to be the publisher of a book? What do you face? What are the challenges? Whom do you deal with? So you may want to take one book, well, do what you like, but I'm really interested in you more as an active figure, but on a day-to-day basis. You know, Prokhorova, oh my God, the other day, Prokhorova here, from academics, it's like Vaginia, goddess, major figure, which there you are. But I know you have a more practical day-to-day existence, which must be very frustrating, very challenging, and I just would love to know if you could give us a little insight into that life.
Do you need a lecture, one more lecture, 2 hours, to explain my day? Well, of course, I love my profession, and I would never do it but for the perestroika and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Many of us just discovered some new possibilities and new talents which we never thought of, and I'm very grateful for that. That was the second youth for us, because my generation was in our prime. We were in early 30s when the collapse of the Soviet Union started. So at least we were more or less educated. We were still young to do something. Not very much experience, but very eager, because half of our life was spent just for nothing. We wasted our time because there was no possibility for real activity. Of course, it's a hard time. Any publisher, we risk every day. You have to choose books, which I think is very important, but on the other, you must sell them. We're doing it not for eternity, but for reading public. So, now I have 22 book series, and 9 of them I'm doing personally. Because I consider they're too important. I do it myself. On the other hand, I save quite a lot of money not paying the editor. So these, I would say, intellectual and practical things are always intertwined. But my publishing house, a specific one, is dealing with high quality publishing. And this is the most risky and most difficult parts of, I would say, sphere of publishing, because we realize that we'll never earn money, we'll never be rich, and if you're at least successful, it means 2% of profit, of year profit. That's, you can put a monument to yourself in a way. And this is not the Russian case, it's international thing. That's in the book market, there are a number of this so-called intellectuals publishing in a way they're doing with such types of books. But instead, well, no money, but quite a lot of respect. So you have to choose in a way. But, what was my day, besides being involved in the publishing business, besides I have 3 journals, not only a New Literary Review, but the second one dealing with social studies. I started in 1998. It's called Неприкосновенный запас, Golden Reserve. It's military term, but it's dealing with social studies. And the third one is fashion theory. This is a new discipline. I started in 2006. So this is my major occupation. Of course, I'm chief editor, still chief editor of New Literary Observer, but I have chief editors for next to journals. And what I'm doing, selling books, it's all spent on my journals. But I think that's the most important thing. This is modernization of humanities, social studies, as I see my activity. So I'm chief editor of the journal. I'm chief editor of the publishing house. I'm editor of 9 series. And besides, I'm involved in charity fund, and I'm running it, so creating all kinds of things. Quite a lot of things to do. Because my publishing house was always seen as a kind of, I would say, independent, like independent university, something like that. So we have 4 conferences under the auspices of the publishing house. We have so many other projects and social things and many other things. This is a huge amount of work, of course. What I'm dealing with authors, I wouldn't talk about it too much. I would say at the end, all publishers should be given, becoming some degree in how we say it? Psychologists in a way, because it's a very difficult thing to deal with people. And I'm happy to deal with so many creative and talented people, but it's always a very dramatic situation. I have to deal with this process, of these material things. Yes, but what I like in my publishing, that you can combine intellectual and practical spheres, so you can always see how these new ideas can be materialized, in what way, how you can present it to the public. And I'm the first reader and the first critic. I can choose whenever trend I want to. And the most interesting thing for me to find this new trend which is only emerging and create, say, a new series, and not only to follow the reader. I think it's very simplified view of the publishing business, but to create this readership because you produce something new. It's always a risk, but very inspiring. So it gives, it's kind of feedback, and it helps you to, to follow, because nowadays I'm not 33, and I'm thinking that, but not for this pressure. I mean, we have. If you start properly, all the projects are growing and growing and growing. You never stop, otherwise it will be a stagnation. And sometimes I wake up, I think, no, I will not go. I can't do it. But I know you should do. You're dressed, go, you drink coffee, go, and you start, again. And it gives you energy. So I think it's okay.